Good morning, everyone. Hi, and welcome to this Spring Knowledge Transfer event. Thank you so much for joining us today alongside South Staffs and Cambridge Water. And today we'll be learning more about the wide-scale improvements made to their vulnerability strategy supported by KELP and Sustainability First. So today's session will also be recorded and put on the Spring platform for anybody who would like to watch it back or share it with any colleagues who couldn't make it today. It will be posted on LinkedIn when that's available, so do make sure to give us a follow there. So a little bit about Spring before we jump into the session for anyone who's not familiar with us. Spring are here to help you deliver against Ofwat's expectations for best practice knowledge sharing across the water sector. Our knowledge sharing service supports the transfer of learnings from projects happening across the industry to improve services and reduce environmental and social impact. With these showcases, alongside our other services that are designed to connect experts across the industry and increase the rate at which improvements can happen, we hope to create project legacy that helps organisations identify and adopt the right solutions at a greater pace. So back to today, I'll share a little bit about the agenda for the session and introduce our speakers before I hand over to the team. But before I do, I just wanted to remind the audience that we will be launching a poll during this event to gain your thoughts. That will come at the very end of the session. Answering our poll is actually the most impactful way that you can help us to make sure these events are providing value to you, your organisation and the wider sector, and that these showcases are supporting faster paced adoptions of solutions. Your insights not only help us to understand the actions you plan to take on the knowledge shared today, but if there was anything more we could have done or shared to ensure successful transfer of the key insights from this project. We'll be launching that poll at the end of the session, as I say, so please make sure to submit your answers as and when that comes through. And for anyone who didn't get a chance to answer at the end, you can always email me your feedback too. Great, so beginning the session today with the agenda. So we have a little bit about vulnerability at South Staffs from Alex Wilkes, who is Director of Customer Services. We have the vulnerability strategy at South Staff, so a little bit more context and value behind that. Then we'll hear about developing a future-proofed vulnerability strategy from our other speakers, some key findings, followed by the project outputs. Then we'll have a short break and come back to hear in more depth about some lessons learned and challenges overcome, before some final reflections and then heading into that final Q&A at the end there. So do make sure to be submitting any questions for the presenting team throughout today's presentation and we'll have those ready to ask during the live Q&A at the end. So just to introduce our speakers today, as I say, we have Alex Wilkes, Customer Service Director at South Staffs and Cambridge Water, Laura Goldsfink, Head of Vulnerability, Nick Holloway, Strategic Customer and Research Manager, Dr. David Lomeo, Founder and Principal Data Scientist at KELP, and David Murray, Executive Director at Sustainability First. So with that all introduced, I'll hand over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Can I just get a thumbs up that everyone can hear me from somebody that I've got on camera? That'd be wonderful, Nick. Oh, lovely. Thank you so much. So, yes, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us to what I hope will be a really interesting, thought-provoking session. For my part, I'm Alex Wilkes. So, yes, Customer Service Director covering South Staffordshire Water and Cambridge Water. Delighted to be with you, joined by two of my brilliant colleagues in Nick Holloway and Laura Goldspink, but I'll allow them to introduce themselves at the start of their speaker slot shortly. What we wanted to do with this session is to share some vital insights from a project that we're really proud of, helping to really understand and better understand the demographics of folks that rely on us every day for the services we provide, and that we believe has really good replicability for the sector at large. So really approaching this with a spirit of transparency, and if you have any follow-up questions, we'd love to hear from you and for you to reach out bilaterally to us as well. For my part, I've been sort of in this sector and this area, particularly around research and vulnerable customers, for the best part of 20 years now, but 19 years of those were across the energy sector before I recently moved over into water. I think across both those sectors, I've seen a significant shift in vulnerability, in particular being viewed as a standalone demographic and something for which we needed some ring-fence bespoke offerings, to now recognizing that ultimately anybody can be vulnerable if the right circumstances align. And therefore, great data is key to allowing us to tailor our services appropriately for customers. Not just therefore viewing this as service for a vulnerable customer, but actually just seeing vulnerability as a crucial component part to general customer service. So I think that's the sort of preamble for where we get to as we sort of introduce our research project. So moving to the second slide. Just to give you a bit of context about our business before we get into the details of the initiative, we operate 2 licence areas across Cambridge and South Staffs. And across those 2 territories, we have around 1.7 million people relying on us every day. So that's serving a population of 1.75 million. What that means in terms of connections is it's just over 700,000 household connections. And as you perhaps expect across those demographics, we do serve 2 very different demographics when we look at it generally, but there are of course pockets of vulnerability in each of those territories. But across South Staffs in particular, we have very high levels of income deprivation, significantly above average on the index of multiple deprivation, for example. From the research itself, it shows us that over a 5-year period, the number of those in defined water poverty has gone from around 1 in 6 to 1 in 4. So we see that situation worsening. And I'm certain you'll all have examples of similar challenges across your own geographies. What that means for us is that we've stood up an extensive affordability support program. So around 1 in 10 customers are currently accessing social tariffs, and on top of that we then have a huge spate of customers that are accessing other advisory services, and as we move into this year, we're bringing more services on stream, certainly in response to the research that we're going to share, that helps us to deliver an ever more bespoke service, particularly for those that are flagging and demonstrating challenges with affordability. Ultimately, the aim is to be able to offer a one-stop shop service that offers and combines support across benefits, debt support, energy saving and access to insulation schemes, as well as traditional water support. And for that, the data exercise is absolutely crucial. So I would hope it's pretty obvious, why this project, in order to deliver a great service, which we're still on a journey to do, of course, we need to understand who our customers are and what they require. Around 54% of our base are PSR eligible, for example. So that reinforces my point that this is no longer about seeing vulnerability as a standalone project and a standalone service. It's absolutely intrinsic if the majority of our customers are facing those sorts of challenges. The key objective and what we wanted to achieve was to allow us to be more front-footed, more proactive, anticipating the needs, not assuming the needs, but certainly anticipating the chance of those needs, so that we can start to design a range of intervention options that ultimately avoid forcing customers to have a one-size-fits-all approach. And why that matters is that ultimately driving better outcomes for customers, better satisfaction, taking seriously our position as a regional monopoly operator, and trying to get to a position where our service offering is such that were customers to have a choice to come and be served by us as a water-only company, they would choose to do so. So brings us to today. Our approach today is total transparency and collaboration, here to share some what we hope is best practice. Any claim of innovative, I think, is relative. You'll all have insights programs of some form, but we just want to share with you a detailed approach that we feel benchmarks well across the sector. Is certainly given us a great deal of scope to begin tailoring our services, and we think has scalability and through that scalability and driving some consistency across UK water companies can only be good for water customers across the UK. Particularly at a time when building trust with customers in a sector which is struggling from a reputational point of view and other wider things happening, I think this is a great opportunity for us to demonstrate we're anticipating and understanding customer needs and that we're designing services around those. So I think the final bit from me before I hand you over to the much more experts within the business that have delivered this project, just to give you a snapshot around our vulnerability strategy. For me, I view it as a bit of a sandwich. So starting with the mission and the principles is that ultimately our mission is to try to meet the bespoke needs of customers. You know, pretty obvious, but we need to take that monopoly position extremely seriously and fight hard to deliver services customers rate highly. And beneath that, the principles are we want customers to be able to rely on us, feel supported, and find it easy to interact when they need to. In the middle of that sandwich, as it were, are the outcomes to make our services as accessible as possible. So services that are in a manner that suits the customer's needs and preferences. Affordable, with bespoke support around that, which, as we all have those pressures of delivering some of our largest ever investment programs, which carry changes in customer bills, we need to do more and more to try to provide targeted affordability support. We want customers, it says their safety and peace of mind, we want them to be able to trust that we have a consistently high standard of service. And we want to be a proactive force for good in the communities we serve, not just responding to those that put their hand up and state they need the help, but to be proactively identifying those and going into the right forums within our communities that give us access to those that need support. But to enable all of that, there are critical enablers, the same ones that you'll see across the sector. We, yeah, of course, need the right people, the right culture and the right systems to make this work. But we also need to understand our customer base. And this is that, at that point that I'll hand you over to my colleagues to talk you through some of the data that is helping us to put ourselves in our customers' shoes in a better way than we did before we had these levels of insight. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you get a lot out of the session. I look forward to some contacts outside of this session, but in the meantime, I will hand you over to Nick to get into the detail.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. Yeah, my name's Nick Holloway. I head up customer insight and research for South Staffs and Cambridge Water. A lot of my role, I focus on consumer research most of the time, but for this particular project, it was all about really getting into the detail of the socio-demographic mapping of our customer bases to support the development of our vulnerability strategy. And I really wanted this to be a way about bringing insight to life in an engaging way to drive data-driven decision making. So this project, to set the context, key call out is the change landscape of the regulatory focus to ensuring that we reduce the risk of customer detriment, basically. So Ofwat introduced their Licence G back in February 2024, which is often referred to as the customer focused licence condition. For those that, though, if you're not familiar with it, it replaces a more rigid rules-based approach with a more flexible principles-based way of looking at vulnerability and making sure that water companies are driving forward their customer experience, whatever situation the customer is in. And a key component of the new license condition is support for vulnerable customers, and really ensuring that support is appropriate for households in vulnerable circumstances. The core focus is on health conditions, the Priority Services Register, but also touches on those who might be struggling to pay or in debt, for example. And as part of this new landscape, each water company is required to prepare and then deliver a vulnerability strategy. And the strategy is all about outlining how it will go about meeting the needs of its varied customer base. So when we submitted our draft strategy back in June 2024, we conducted kind of a high-level desk research review of the demographics of both our supply regions and our customers, and linked to a number of vulnerability flags. And we felt we had a decent look at this, but some of the data we were seeing, we felt we really had to shift our knowledge even further as we looked ahead to submitting our final vulnerability strategy back in June of last year. So I think it's really important at this point to say that as a medium-sized water company, it's absolutely critical that we prioritise our resources and activities in a cost-effective way that will lead to best customer outcomes. So we were looking at the work we'd done before and decided that we really needed to up the game, so to speak, in terms of the level of detail, and looking at it in a really localized way, because our business plan, we talk a lot around being a trusted local supplier, and that's our ambition. But in order to do that, you really need a strong community presence, and to target that effectively, you need to understand who your customers are and what their needs are at that kind of localized level in order to be able to prioritize your efforts and support customers in the most effective way. So in order to get to that point, we needed really to develop a robust insight base in order to drive decision making. So what we wanted was a solution that we could future-proof to reduce ongoing costs and ensure that we could react quicker to the needs of our customers in a world that is increasingly prone to shocks and changes. So we've had pandemics, we've had wars in different parts of the world that have impacted our country in terms of the cost of living and other factors. And we recognise this journey is one of continuous improvement. So we wanted to build a solution that could be updated over time and make sure that we could react. And we also need to consider, as I said before, that we obviously are funded to give a certain level of service that's in the best needs of our customers. So being very targeted is a key part of that. Okay, so on this slide, I've kind of detailed the project objectives in terms of the socio-demographic data set that we wanted to bring together. And the key thing for us is we recognise that this needs to be a partnership approach, because we didn't really have the internal skill set to get where we needed to go. So we approached Sustainability First, whose skill set is really being the customer advocate champion who could really bring a critical friends review and work with us collaboratively to make sure that we were really thinking ahead in terms of the development of our vulnerability strategy, and then working alongside Kelp, who as data scientists would be able to bring that really strong analytical rigor to the approach we were looking for. And as Alex mentioned earlier, this project was focused mainly on PSR health indicators around vulnerability, but we also wanted to make sure we looked at it in the round and therefore bring in a financial vulnerability view alongside that, given that I'm sure you'll all recognise from your own data there is a strong overlaps between financial and health vulnerability. So absolute key success factor to this project is that everyone was lined up behind a clear set of objectives which are detailed on the slide, and that we feel gave us a really strong footing and ultimately led to what we felt is a successful project. Because during projects of this nature, as you'll see in a bit, the complexity means that as it's quite technical, you're consistently needing to anchor back to your objectives to make sure you stay on track throughout the project and end up with the right outcome. So why this project? So as Alex said before, we have around 18% of our customer base on our PSR at the moment. And we knew from the early work that Ofwat had done around this, using their methodology, that over 50% of our customers would qualify for PSR support. But what we really didn't know for sure was, in terms of a granular level, was what was the true size of the gap between our current PSR and what the true population need was at an individual PSR health code level, whether that be someone who might be suffering from kidney disease, or they might have a visual or hearing impairment, etc. So we were really looking for those hotspots where we could really get into that localized level data and see how it varied across our two regions. And also the most critical thing is, how is that need going to change over time, particularly as we look 5, 10, 15 years ahead up to 2040. So being able to understand the current gap today and how that's going to change is kind of the heart of this project and what we wanted to achieve. So that kind of hopefully sets the scene about why this was an important project and what we were hoping to achieve. So I'll hand over to David at Sustainability First to start talking about the detail of how we went about the project. Thank you, David.
Hi, thanks, Nick. Thanks so much, everyone. Really good to see you all today. I'm just going to give you a bit more of that kind of scene setting, but from within the context of the partnership and the project as a whole. So this is the kind of the why vulnerability strategy needs to change. We believe that this shift away from viewing vulnerability as maybe as a narrow PSR or compliance exercise towards a place-based, forward-looking strategy really matters. If we want to deliver that kind of genuinely high quality service for every customer, then we need to understand not just who's vulnerable today, but where vulnerability is emerging, how it's likely to change over time. And that's why bringing this group of organisations together with South Staffs and Cambridgeshire Water as the lead client, but with Sustainability First and KELP working together, we can combine that kind of policy insight with spatial and predictive data to support decisions that remain robust throughout the AMP and beyond. So I'm going to briefly introduce you to us as partners, and we'll hear from Davide as we work through the slides this morning as well. But just as a quick intro, for those of you who don't know us, Sustainability First is an independent charity and a politically neutral think tank. We work predominantly in water and energy, but we also have work interests in, especially around vulnerability, in financial services and telco as well. We run a national network called ESAN, which is the Essential Services Access Network, and that runs as part of Sustainability First's approach to working. In this instance, the reason we are closely connected to South Staffs and Cambridgeshire Water is that they're a member of our Sustainability Leaders Group, which I'll also introduce to you towards the end of today's session. So we're really passionate about protecting and repairing the environment, but also promoting fairness for all, including for future generations, future customers. We do that through undertaking research, by convening policy discussion, and trying to make these complex issues accessible for the public to engage in, as well as for us as professionals, and promote that unheard and often underrepresented voice in policy setting and decision making. And then we try to bring that thinking into a practical approach to develop solutions that specifically lead to positive influence around the sectors that we're operating in, whether that's through government decision making and the politicians who are pushing the politics of policy change, the policies themselves and legislation, and then of course the regulatory landscape that we all know and understand from the day-to-day operations within the water sector and the business practices that relate to it. And of course, as Nick mentioned as well, KELP's role as leading data scientists is to help to combine that kind of data analytical approach to various, I suppose you might describe it as dark arts within data science and strategic thinking, combining satellite remote sensing, geospatial analytics and machine learning to turn those complex multi-source data points into a strategic insight to help give us a steer on where we want to take specific business problems forwards, and think about spatial modelling and forecasting as we do so. So what are the new ways that we might want to try to address the problem? This was deliberately, first and foremost, it's worth repeating how important it is to have a complementary partnership. This isn't a traditional, maybe consulting approach that you might see where work is commissioned and then those who've been commissioned go off and do that work and then come back with a report at the end and say, here, that's the work done. This is very much an active live partnership that we were working through iteratively throughout the process. And so whilst we bring that kind of system level lens linking vulnerability to regulation, affordability and resilience, and KELP bring that advanced geospatial and data science capability. It's actually how we bring those skill sets to life in the way that we try to address these problems. So this is trying to move us beyond that PSR only kind of mindset and treating vulnerability as a strategic planning input. It's also to introduce emerging needs, so like digital exclusion, unpaid care, heat risk, things that you might not see within the approach that that PSR currently has been looking at, and the needs codes, the specific sets of needs codes that might be there to inform and help to interrogate data that aren't necessarily therefore consistently captured today, but already actually shape customer experience. And critically, it's using that granularity of geospatial mapping so that vulnerability shows up at a neighborhood level rather than being averaged away at a company scale or based on regional and national averages. And that hopefully enables that earlier intervention, that proactive approach as a water company to think about the targeted decision making and the strategic approach to managing vulnerability over time. And I suppose allied to that as well is it's almost a principles or a philosophical approach to what's going on, like what the change in the mindset that we take to addressing this as well. So first and foremost, we start from this idea of inclusive by design position, that designing mainstream services that work for most customers by default rather than relying on opt-in schemes, that we also move away from self-disclosure towards proactive identification. We'd heard already just how many customers are recognized to be eligible to qualify for PSR, but eligibility versus who's on a list can be quite distinctly different. Recognizing that many customers never necessarily label themselves as vulnerable as well, but that they may have needs that need to be addressed. And finally, that vulnerability is explicitly linked to resilience. So big issues like climate risk, heat waves, flooding, and to wider social value questions. This really does reframe how we think about essential services as a part of that positive preventative action that we can take and the strengthening of community resilience in a system. So I suppose that the next most important point is saying that there needs to be a collective value judgment in the data that we're looking at. And so as I'm about to hand over to Davide to go into the methodology and some of that detail, it's also important to note that it's not just finding those data points that we're referring to. It's also being clear and transparent with the assumptions that we're making and an understanding of where that data has come from, its age, its robustness, and then of course if you're bringing data from multiple sources, how that all interplays with each other so that we can make clear but shared value judgments on what assumptions we're making, where we might have proxies, so equivalent reference points to the data that might not exist but that might still give us useful indicators to make those decisions. So just to flag just how important it is to have that value judgment mindset at the same time as going out to find that robust data set too. And I'll pause whilst Davide takes over from KELP.
Hi everyone, very glad to be here, and thank you everyone to participate to this event today. So as David was saying, I think one of the most difficult and challenging things to do in data science in general is gathering good quality data that you could use then to gain insight of whatever is your objective. In the case of this project, in collaboration with Sustainability First, our first objective was to turn these PSR codes into to match them to existing data sets in order for us to run the analysis. And out of the 672 PSR codes, which of course are all identified on vulnerabilities, we identified 36 that could be matched to appropriate data set that we could that are available publicly. And these are things like hearing difficulties, mental health conditions, and the challenging thing, and obviously, and plus 11 additional ones that we have proposed to sustainability to South staff in collaboration with Sustainability First that we think are a good addition to the PSR code mapping over the service areas. And the challenging things about publicly available data sets is that depending on who collects them, they are provided in different formats. As you may know, in the UK, there's this very good way of mapping geographies at LSOA level, which are roughly between 400 and 1200 households. However, not all datasets are provided in the same formatting, or at least in the same geographical size. And oftentimes you do find them provided at a regional level and national level, which does complicate the picture when you try to determine vulnerabilities within smaller service areas. And so what we had to do was taking this data set up from different sources, do a first scanning on the quality of this data set to be used as proxies for the PSR code we were interested in. And so we basically did some ranking on how, not only on what was the priority for Ofwat and South Staff Water, but also on how likely and how confident we were that the data set could represent the specific PSR code. Just to give an example, for the PSR code for blind people, we did find a very good data set from the Royal National Institute of Blind People. And we were we were highly confident that that data set would represent that group of people. But things like chronic and serious illnesses, which is a PSR code for Ofwat, we couldn't really determine one data set that could be represented, that could represent that PSR code. So we ended up having to some people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma, type 2 diabetes, and so on. And obviously in that case, our confidence in how that data set or some of data sets represented the PSR code would diminish. And of course, we prioritized in this work, given that we had so many PSR codes, we prioritized what was the highest priority for South Staff Water specifically. And so just the majority of data we got from census data, but we also got some data set from parallel data sets that allowed us to again to map onto the service areas. Now let me see if I can. Cool. So when it came to the gap analysis, that was the most of the work was really trying to downsize those data set to the service areas. But once we had that baselining, then it was as easy as subtracting what was on the PSR register for South Staff and Cambridge Water, and essentially express that as a percentage. And so with that, we essentially were able to determine what were the uncertainties or perhaps the gaps between what was known by SSC given their PSR register and what we could see and what we could obtain from publicly available data sets. When it came to doing forecasting, that was the kind of more challenging part of the project, because obviously the project for a project at this scale, it becomes quite difficult to run not only projections for the demographic projections, but also having those projections made for things like health conditions. And there are like proprietary models that one could use, and they are available out there, obviously being careful about how these are used. But is quite challenging to having to do that for a single project. And in fact, many things that we have considered were things that were, so many of the uncertainties around data sets and around modeling were implicit to the data set that we use. For example, migration patterns, those would be the specific model from ONS, similar to mortality rates and aging population. And when it came to, again, I think, yes. So when it came to the key vulnerability indicators, we then determined some of them that we could effectively project and forecast in the future to 20, 30, 35, and 40. This would be, for example, people with ages over 75, 85, school-age children, but also diabetes, dementia, mental health condition, and so on. So here I just want to show you what a gap analysis kind of look like broadly, and here you can see on the first two columns show the count of PSR needs in the service areas according to the data that we found, and we associated as proxies to the various PSR codes. And here is the comparison to the national prevalence, and so essentially taking the national levels and compare those prevalence to South Staff Water and Cambridge Water, and see what were the gaps, or what were at least the differences with the national prevalences. And then the gap that you see here in these two columns is essentially a difference between what it was on the PSR register for South Staff and Cambridge Water, and what we found at least was likely from the data sets. And here, of course, the projections on the right-hand side, and the change that we think that we project to be for each of these PSR codes. And you can see here how we go from 41% for blind people up to 68% for over 85s, which is a marker of aging population. So now I think I will hand over to David.
Thank you again. Thanks for that, Davide. So feels like I might be stating the bleeding obvious when talking to a group of professionals in the water industry, but there's nothing like the abolition of a regulator to make everyone super busy. So time has passed since this project was delivered, and I thought it might be worthwhile just capturing a sense of the policy landscape then at the time of this project, and then also looking at the now, to just give us a bit of a sense of where, firstly recognizing how fast-paced these changes are kind of playing out, but also how they might be informing decisions like how we approach strategic questions around vulnerability. So at the then time, so when this project was commissioned, vulnerability was already rising up the regulatory agenda, but the framework itself was still in transition. Expectations focused on PSR growth, on company-specific strategies, better identification, but minimum standards were not yet fixed, and that context shaped this work, aligning the project with Ofwat's direction of travel, and not just the kind of the moment that it was launched. And so at that point also, the policy still tended to separate out affordability, non-financial vulnerability, and resilience into different conversations. National affordability schemes like Watersure were also widely recognised as not meeting the needs that we needed for today and the here and now, but that reform itself was still pending. And that's why this project deliberately joined those strands together, recognising that customers' experience of vulnerability as a system, not as isolated categories. So, of course, as we look at strategic challenges and think about how we address vulnerabilities of various types, of course, a customer, an individual, doesn't make these distinctions or think about themselves either ever as vulnerable or think about vulnerability in quite the ways that we're essentially asked to think about them from our standpoint within the water industry. And so fast forward to today, and since that project is completed, the policy direction has accelerated significantly. We now have got clearer minimum standards, stronger accountability, explicit expectations around proactive identification, inclusive by design services, and transparent outcome reporting. These are becoming the mainstay of the approach that we thought might be coming down the line, and most importantly, Ofwat's position that around half of households that we saw in that statistic earlier on, which carries straight through to South Staffs and Cambridgeshire Water, that half of households may be eligible for PSR support. That really does reframe vulnerability as a mainstream service design challenge. It's not a marginal one whatsoever. And so vulnerability is now also directly linked to license compliance, to reputational scrutiny, and to customer trust. You'll see as well that CCW's approach to this challenge has shifted from a question which may have been, do you have a strategy, towards, is it delivering measurable outcomes? What is it that you're now doing with that strategic approach, and how are you addressing them? What's the learning that you've got as a company? And alongside Watersure reform and DEFRA's wider vision for water, vulnerability now sits firmly within a legitimacy and trust agenda, not just a social policy one. So there are huge challenges and opportunities here for water companies in that bigger, wider kind of trust and confidence, public trust and confidence building and rebuilding in the sector as well. That's certainly worth keeping in our mind too. We're going to now just dive straight into some key findings, and again, so I'm going to summarize those key findings from the PSR gap analysis and vulnerability forecasts, focusing on what they mean for strategy and resourcing. So the headline finding is that vulnerability levels are already high and expected to grow. And using Ofwat's methodology, South Staffs and Cambridge Water, it shows consistently higher financial and non-financial vulnerability than Cambridge and England as a overall. So sorry, South Staffs shows that consistently higher financial, non-financial vulnerability compared with the other area that this water company covers in Cambridge and in England as a whole. And that has real implications for how resources are prioritised, both internally and relative to other companies. This table supports that point. The key takeaway here is it's not essentially the precise numbers, it's the consistency of the signal that we're getting across these indicators. And looking ahead, the largest growth areas are in access, communication, and care-related needs. Aging, disability, sensory impairment, long-term illnesses, they're all projected to rise substantially to 2040. And many customers will sit across multiple categories, increasing the complexity for frontline services and for the partnerships that are needed to proactively address these challenges. And these projections do reinforce why vulnerability strategy must align with long-term planning. An aging and increasingly disabled population combined with environmental and social pressures weakens household resilience. So if we only plan around today's data, strategy will already be out of date. I think this is the point where I hand back over to Davide just to talk us through some of these data points.
Yeah, here just wanted to point out a few things. So as you can see at the top of these graph, you see the three dots of different colors that define the baselines that we used for projections. And as you can tell already, just by the baselining approach, you see how we had to use data sets from different years, because some of them are annually provided. Some of them are biannually provided, some of them are provided every 10 years as the census data. And so there isn't really a standardized way for us to ensure that the baselining that we do in any point in time will have data set from the same year. And therefore, that already is an uncertainty in itself, because there is no way for anyone really to truly ensure that all the available data sets, pre-available data set right now, can be baselined to the same level. And therefore, when you make projections, you have to be aware of that uncertainty. However, when we talk about projections in the future, it becomes slightly easier to then kind of overcome this baselining issue. However, you also have to always take this projection with a grain of salt, and be careful about how you handle these the uncertainties around these projections, because projections for this project and for many other projects, I would imagine, will be based on pre-existing models. For example, for health data, we used a model from the real impact report. And it would be unimaginable for us to reproduce that model, because they have used data from hundreds of sources and is a proprietary model. So you'd have to essentially trust that obviously they have done the due diligence, and they are peer-reviewed models that we can trust. But at the same time, it is unlikely that any one of us will be able to reproduce that model and fine-tune it to the service areas that that you want to use it into. And therefore, using those models, we were able to make these projections. And the reason why they are, but they're still limited to the point-based projections, because those projections were made at national level, and therefore we had to account for population dynamics within the service areas. And so those numbers that you see there, they very well differ from prevalence in other parts of the UK, because those are specific to the South Staff service area. And so if we were all to sort of do that due diligence and ensure that we can apply those models, having an understanding of the demographic movements within service areas, then we are able to make projections that are sort of fine-tuned to the populations that lives across the UK. Yeah.
And just before we move on to the next slide, I noticed as well, thanks to Leah, that we've just launched the first poll question as well, and you can see that some responses are coming in through the chat. So just to flag that the question being asked at this point is, in one word, what does vulnerability support need more of in the next 5 years? So please do take part in that poll as well. I'll just click us forwards, Davide, to that next slide. There we go. So I wanted to just recognise that providing financial projections is notoriously difficult. However, during AMP8, even in this best case scenario, a sizable number of households are likely to struggle to afford their water bills and would benefit from support. And so if we think, about our own homes as well, and the scale at which the financial pressures might build, it's not necessarily that the water bill will be top of that list, especially going through an energy crisis and fuel poverty. There are huge bills that are in front of us, but of course this doesn't help, and they do collectively combine to have a very big impact. Wanted to note at this point, towards the bottom left, you'll see on the slide as well, that the definition that relates to absolute poverty is defined as having an income below 60% of the median income, the median average income from back in 2010-11, adjusted for inflation, which is just over £15,000 a year. I think our friends at Spring will also put into the chat a link to that PDF that we referred to as well, called Turning the Tide, that just refers to that definition and to a snapshot of what's happening in terms of absolute poverty in the UK. But you can also see on this slide that there are differences between the pessimistic and optimistic scenarios, which is what helped to guide and steer us towards what we were thinking more broadly. In the pessimistic scenario, absolute poverty is projected to increase from just under 123,000 to 131,500 households by 2930 in the South Staffs area. And from 19,800 to 21,900 in the Cambridge area. Given recent government announcements on benefit cuts, these figures are likely to be underestimates. On the optimistic scenario, absolute poverty would decline to 115,300 at 19%, and South Staff's area, that is for that number. And then in Cambridge, it would decline to 22,600 households. We do not provide as well, just to flag, plausible projections for financial vulnerabilities to 2040, given the wide range of factors that can influence these, but just to really highlight just how complex and difficult it can be to try to work through financial vulnerabilities, especially much further out. I don't know if it's worth just showing here on the right hand side. You can see those distinct, almost kind of tale of two cities kind of areas when it comes to distribution of income in the two water supply areas for this water company. You see that the highest peak. The highest levels of income relate to the Cambridge area, whereas South Staff seems to be tracking very close to the England average, but is distinctly lower. You can also see on the left how that geographical distribution plays out as well in terms of estimated numbers of people on universal credit claimants. Again, you can see just how that kind of patchwork, that mosaic, plays out across this area. And now I think we're passing back over to Nick.
Hi. Yes, thank you, David. Yeah, Lauren and I are now going to talk through some of the ways that water companies can benefit from a project like this. So I think the first thing on is this. The main driver for this project was to make sure that we had a high level of confidence that our vulnerability strategy is tailored around the needs of our customer base and how those might change over time. So I've lifted on the right hand side of this slide an infographic that basically summarizes the 5 socio-demographic golden threads that underpin our strategy. You'll no doubt recognize these from some of the work you might have done for those who are in the sector, but the one that really stood out for us was the expected growth in customers who might lack resilience in their everyday lives. So as society fragments and more people live in isolation, and if you don't have a family, friend or a carer support, it can notably increase the level of risk, particularly at times during when the water supply might be temporarily interrupted. So as we can't be everywhere at once all the time, having this really granular level of insight at LSOA area split out is really important, and it allows us to prioritize our efforts where the need is greatest and where we expect to see the biggest level of growth in vulnerability within our customer bases. So, and there's also the added benefit that as we move forward now and we move into price review 2029, that we can start to address and come towards business cases that best support the needs of our customers, and we have the data to be able to back that up. And as David mentioned earlier, there are certain areas within our patch where we see notable differences between the level of need for a particular health code between our patches and potentially other areas of the country, and also between South Staffs and Cambridge regions. Right, and I'll hand over to Laura then to take you through the next slide.
Thank you, Nick, and yeah, good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you all here today. Just a very quick introduction on my part, as I've not had the chance to properly introduce myself yet. So, Laura Goldsmith, Head of Vulnerability at South Staffs in Cambridge. I've recently started with the business, so just February, so it's pretty new to me, but like Alex, I've actually been within the energy sector for 20 years, working in a very similar space. So yeah, what's been great is kind of coming on board at this point in the process with this, and obviously for me now, you know, the key focus is, you know, understanding where the opportunities are with this kind of data and this project for us. And here we've pulled out some of those. I mean, as Nick has already alluded to, having that granular data at this local level is crucial to inform our decision making looking forward, especially when resource and budgets are stretched, which I'm sure a lot of you can sympathise with. And looking at some of the data, taking outreach campaigns as an example, you know, we know that in South Staffs that almost 30,000 of our customers are unable to communicate in English. And we also know that this is going to be growing at pace looking forward to 2040. And even, you know, beneath that, we know that in some of our South Staffs communities, over 50% speak Punjabi as their main language. So having this level of information will afford us opportunities to develop some targeted communications and delivery around the priority service register, which can be shared to boost and encourage inclusion for this currently underrepresented group. And again, in terms of having ownership of a tool that can be evolved over time and feed into updated data sets, having this information at our fingertips will enable us to continually refine and expand our understanding of what vulnerability excuse me, vulnerability looks like in our regions, and this in turn will allow us to address any emerging gaps, geographical and needs-based, through partnership network development. And one of the examples we'll be looking at shortly will be dialysis centres and local hospital renal units with regards to chronic kidney disease, which, along with a couple of other examples, we'll go into more detail shortly. So, as already indicated, partnership working is fundamental to the success of our vulnerability strategy. It enables reach, engagement, and a level of expertise that we would be unable to achieve in isolation. Nick has already said we can't be everywhere all the time. And our approach to engaging community stakeholders focuses on a matrix which is based on a level of interest versus a level of influence, which is indicated by this matrix on the right of the slide. And what this is ensuring is that we have the right voices shaping our frontline delivery services, which does reduce the risk of this one-size-fits-all approach, which Alex mentioned earlier too, and that we don't end up excluding the harder to reach groups. And applying this localized data via this model will enable us to prioritise which partnerships and relationships we want to pursue, but also which are likely to have the biggest impact for us and for our customers.
Oh, thanks, Laura. Yeah, we just thought we'd pull this slide out here that shows a worked example of one of the health code needs that came out of the project. So the map on the left is showing a breakdown by LSOA area of those living with kidney disease. So this is obviously a particularly high priority health condition for water companies, given these people need access to a continuous water supply, particularly if they're on dialysis. So it really just brings to life the hotspots across in this particular case, our Cambridge region. Just to show that where we really need to target our efforts to grow the number of people who currently aren't on our PSR who should be for this particular condition. And importantly for us, it really opened our eyes as to the fact that we were assuming before, I think through conversations and other data, that the hotspot areas were in particular locations, but actually particularly around the city centre, but actually it was actually the rural areas on the west hand side of the patch where we were seeing the greatest number of people impacted by this. So this then means our outreach teams, as Laura was saying, can now link in with local GPs, renal units, our community services to help us drive uptake to ensure that we have the highest level of coverage possible. And it's visualizing data sets like this at a more granular level that allows us to form the right partnerships and really for our teams to understand the situation on the ground and plan their resources accordingly. So it's a really good example of data-driven decision making. And hand back to Laura.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So we have a project ongoing at the moment, a universal metering project. It's a major investment as part of our current business plan, and as the slide indicates, 166,000 meters by 2030, and it's probably one of the biggest customer facing projects we've undertaken for some time. And with this in mind, we know that switching to a water meter carries a notable financial and emotional well-being risk to some of the most vulnerable members of our communities. So it's crucial that we are as proactive as possible in identifying who may need that additional support during this transition. And without this project and the data sets that it's generated, we'd be reliant on PSR data alone to signify where that level of need is, which is, as we know already, has significant gaps. So what this data has enabled us to do is signpost to community officers and frontline dig teams the prevalence of certain vulnerabilities within the areas in which the delivery is being rolled out and the programme, and we're able to feed that into those work programmes so that we are and they are prepared with the right information to have the right conversations. And furthermore, I think understanding the scale of need in more detail across our regions has enabled us to justify our resource position. So what is needed from a community engagement perspective to provide this tailored support.
Great, thanks, Laura. And just building, I mean, the work that sustainability in first and KELP has helped us to achieve. It also now gives us a launch pad to layer on other socio-demographic data sets to provide more targeted, even more granular support for customers. So, for example, we're currently working with our partners at CACI to use data sets to identify households who we feel, and the data is telling us, their bills are likely to go up when they move on to a meter because they might have high occupancy household, for example, and then also looking at the lens of which of those households will struggle to afford that increase, and therefore there's more risk for them in terms of that. And we know there's going to be a degree of overlap which we'll hopefully track through, that there'll be households who have health conditions that require higher levels of water use in order to manage that condition. So having that really targeted household view will enable us to put in much more proactive handheld journey for these highest risk groups, for example, increased meter read frequencies, having affordability checkups on payment plans to make sure there's no unwanted bill shock, and then targeted home water efficiency visits tailored around specific needs that customers have. So it's a great way of just combining data sets and being able to support customers as we move through this program. So, and then to finish this section, then we thought at the end of the project we took a step back and reflected on what we had learned, and it really is that robust data sets are central to enabling effective prioritization, particularly when you have budget and resources that can't extend to everything you might want to do all at once. So, which lead us to the thought that could this evolve into a national investment where developing a forecasting model that could be updated regularly with the latest data sets as they're released and then deployed at a company level? Could that bring real and additional benefits for companies, but also regulators and wider stakeholders, and ultimately then on to the consumer? And we've detailed on the slide here some of those benefits. And we feel there's a real opportunity here for this data to really target innovation investments to where the need is greatest, and also further improve regulatory oversight that's progressed, as David outlined earlier, over the last few years around vulnerability. So the scale of the challenge is obvious from the data and the forecasts in the growth of PSR that we saw coming out of this project. So it's never been more important to understand where our customers are and how their needs are going to change over time. And because we're living in this uncertain world now, and with all these different trends feeding together, we feel there's a good opportunity that we can achieve more together as a whole sector, working together to understand our customers' needs. So when we come back after the break, we're going to be talking more about the lessons learned and how we can overcome these challenges.
The first bit that I thought that Nick, Davide and myself might want to rest on is looking at lessons learned from the context of PSR. And these are just some kind of key takeaways from our perspective. So the PSR needs to be seen as a service platform. That registration alone isn't really sufficient, and the value really comes from how the insight that's used from a PSR platform is then helping to shape service design and frontline delivery. That kind of headline PSR growth targets can mask underlying complexity, that not all eligible customers require the same type or intensity of support, and risk of harm does vary by circumstance and by context. We've talked as well a couple of times about that future PSR challenge on scale and sustainability, that with up to half of households potentially being eligible according to Ofwat's definitions, this kind of reactive or manual approach doesn't really scale and doesn't meet the needs of the majority of customers. So we do need to rethink and reframe how we approach managing and planning for service provision to support those in vulnerable circumstances. And part of that is that inclusivity by design, that that really does help to reduce pressure on PSR over time, making mainstream the communication and service approach so that it's accessible to prevent vulnerability before that kind of bespoke support is actually required, getting on the front foot, as Alex said at the start of today's session. And clearly as well, a big part of this is about partnerships, and they absolutely are essential to closing these PSR gaps. So water companies can't and shouldn't be expected to be able to reach all customers on their own. This is about being a part of the community and the society that we're operating in, and finding and building relationships with those trusted intermediaries and cross-sectoral reference points as well. So I'm just going to pause at that point and ask maybe Nick, in the first instance, what your kind of reflections are from this kind of PSR perspective.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, I think the main takeaway when we got towards the end of the project was just the scale of the challenge looking ahead to 2040, because although we'd had a decent view of kind of the demographics, which obviously this project enhanced at a local level, it was having a prediction of how particular health codes and age profiles are going to change moving in the future, and that driving a really clear prioritization for us around efforts, where we put our effort, that we, after a few workshops, decided to focus on moving forward, particularly in the early stages of this AMP, is looking at those with the biggest PSR gaps between where we are today and where we ideally need to be, given the data, and then those areas where the need is going to grow fastest, particularly over the next 5-10 years, because that's where we should be prioritizing our efforts as a water company to start with, in terms of closing those gaps and making sure that when there's a supply interruption, we have good coverage across our PSR, for just one example. So yeah, that was a big takeaway. And I think, as I said before, the other one was that it really brings home the scale of the challenge around resilience within communities, and it got us thinking about, could there be different ways in the future of defining vulnerability, just not through a health needs code, but also by the level of risk that particular household has. So, for example, if you have a living carer, but you have the same health condition as someone who doesn't, then the person who doesn't is potentially at greater risk during a supply interruption. So there's all these different angles that this data sort of opens up discussions within the business about how we can improve the way we do things. So those are a couple of reflections for myself from a water company perspective, and just looking at the data within my role as helping to guide the business around decision making.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. And maybe just before coming to Davide as well, just conscious of the responses that have come through from the poll as well. The first question was about how confident you feel that you are that your current vulnerability approach is future ready. So for up to 2035 and to 2040, and the results at the snapshot point was suggesting that 66% of respondents are in that kind of number 3, kind of middling. About 16% are feeling slightly less confident, but there isn't there aren't any 4s or 5s. So I think that helps to reinforce how we're seeing this kind of changing nature and transience of approach, and the challenges that we're seeing and experiencing in this kind of the changing regulated space that we're operating in as well. And what might increase your confidence most as well, so some of the key kind of words coming out through the word cloud are scalability, and the challenges around that, thinking about mitigation and deliverability, recognizing unintended consequences, thinking about specific areas, geographies, and future needs, which I think is kind of telling as well. And then asking as well, which element of the approach that you've seen feels most transferable to your organization. The one that stands out most is future forecasting. The second to that is partnership working. So recognizing that there's a real need to be able to get to grips with what other organizations and service providers are out there who can specifically help to meet certain needs within your customer base with those specific vulnerability needs. And translating insights into decisions comes third as well. So kind of taking stock of what the data is telling us and what the forecasting is telling us to understand what that might mean from a strategic perspective. Davide, have you got any reflections on this portion on the PSR, or shall we move to the next section?
I think probably on the next slide I would have some more views, some more informed views.
No problems at all. So just the same again, and maybe I'll come to you first this time, Davide. From a forecasting, data and affordability, some kind of key takeaways I feel that are worth us pausing on. Firstly, that affordability is the hardest dimension to forecast robustly. It's highly sensitive to those government policy choices, and of course, therefore, over time, knowing who's in government and what the politics of that day are, and what those kind of top level at this moment in time. We have a missions-led government with very clear sets of key policy areas that matter to this government here and now. But of course, that can and will change irrespective of what colour government is actually in control. But also other changes, so inflation, wages, housing costs, and benefit rules, which can change rapidly. And of course, we've seen this a few times. The volatility of geopolitics and the impact that has on our day-to-day lives and the costs of goods and services. Long-term projections, thinking about that, they do require scenarios, not single forecasts. So the project showed us that the importance of modelling ranges and policy pathways is probably the most important thing to keep in mind, rather than presenting this kind of false precision, this idea that there is a very precise nature to scenarios in the future, when that's not true. Recognizing and embracing and understanding the uncertainty that exists is really, really important. From a national data sets perspective, we don't have control over these, so they can lag behind the lived experiences that we all see. And census and health data are robust reference points, but they are also slow to update. Census data is on a 10-year cycle. So this creates a constant tension between the accuracy and the timeliness. So the point at which you're approaching, trying to meet the needs of your business to deliver against a strategy like this one, and the nature of the data and its age and its timeliness when it's available, when it's most recently updated. The next point is that early ambition does need to be refined. We need to think, whilst having kind of initial aspirations to forecast all vulnerability dimensions equally, we realise that would be unrealistic. And so we do have to think about how we prioritise what we need to focus on for the most decision relevant insights. And again, this highlights the importance of that value judgment in thinking about data and forecasting and strategic approach. And then finally, that transparency of uncertainty. So, we're also in this need to rebuild trust and confidence in the sector as a whole, and with the public's kind of mind's eye and media attention. And so that transparency really does help to build credibility, being explicit about the assumptions that we're making, recognizing the limitations, and having what levels of confidence do we have as we're going through thinking about making these decisions and then putting those proposals to the regulators. So Davide, I just wonder what your reflections are on those points.
Yes, I think I will start from the last point about transparency, because I think is the most kind of the most pressing thing that I've noticed as I went through this project with you and South Staff Waters. So I do have an academic background, and I'm not afraid to say that I didn't have any experience in vulnerability strategy before this project, and so I've never worked on PSR codes before and PSR code mapping before. And so the way I approached this project was under an academic perspective. So I went out there and looked at what was available, what was already done from other institutions, other consultancies and whatnot. And I think that too often I've noticed a pattern where something is delivered, but uncertainties are not clearly defined and communicated. And what that means is that you can't really replicate models that, for example, have been used for a specific task. And so I think it was very important for us to actually go back and say, okay, let's have a look at what they basically go from the ground up and say, let's look at the data set that we have available. How do they represent these PSR codes? Are we confident that they do? Are we not confident that they do? And this is where our kind of early ambition had to be refined, kind of occurred, because there was this, we had 72 PSR codes to work with, but really with the data that we had available, we could only reliably work with 32. And for projections, even less than that, because they weren't really pre-available models that we could use to make those projections. And those that we did use were the only ones that we found that really had a solid foundation, and that we were and that we knew that we could rely upon. And this brings me to the national dataset lag, lived experience. As you obviously know, census data, it runs every 10 years, and these are just snapshots in time, and gives an indication on where we are as a country. But at the same time, it doesn't really, it's really difficult to model what that looks like. For example, giving a practical example, we had some data that we had available to use during this project was prior COVID and prior Brexit. Therefore, we do acknowledge that there are some limitations in how the 2018 data would represent certain PSR codes, specifically in the migration side of things. And so when we think about what data we use, I think we also have to think about not just when it was reported, but how this data can then be updated every year. And since, I do obviously have, we can open this for discussion later, but I think obviously there are ways for us to be able to produce our own data to make that work ourselves. And when it comes to projections, that is, I think the simplest way of putting this is models are as good as the data that you input them. And so if you're not confident in the data that you have, automatically your model will not will not be trustworthy. And when it comes to doing projections, I think I can take the example of the IPCC reports. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but in there you have two types of projections. You have the representative concentration pathways. Those are just the physical stuff that you have several models, you have 4 pathways, and these are the emissions. But then we have they also have the shared socioeconomic pathways that do take into account how the economy and how people behave over time. And so when we think about making projections, relying on single numbers is never really a good idea. And in fact, in most cases, you should rely more on models that provide you a range of possibilities rather than a point estimate, because the point estimate is likely not going to be the things that you really want. And so this is why I think having scenarios and uncertainty bounds is kind of fundamental when it comes to projections.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Davide. And just before coming to you, Nick, I'm conscious as well that the first poll earlier on, I didn't just pause to reflect on some of the kind of the keywords that were coming up through the word cloud, which was you were being asked in one word, what does vulnerability support need more of in the next 5 years? And it's just some keywords that were coming out through that word cloud are awareness, tailored support, personalization, proactivity, standard practice, but then also empathy, adaptability and accessibility were there too. So Nick, any thoughts and reflections on this?
Yeah, I think the main one from a water company perspective was make sure you have lots of check-ins during the project, because Davide and David had talked about all the different challenges that you face with lots of different data sets and forecast models. So we made sure that we had very regular check-ins with our core project working team, and then we drew in CC Water, we drew in our independent challenge group, independent board members, all to bring their experience and expertise, so that every time we made a decision around how we were going to handle different data sets, we had experts challenging from different angles, and I felt that worked really well in terms of coming to an agreement on how we were going to handle some of the uncertainties in the data. And I think it's absolutely critical, just echoing what Davide said around being very clear in the final report around what the decisions and the caveats and the limitations are of the data, because no data is perfect, and I think we need to remember that, and whenever we're making decisions we need to refer back to that. But it gives us a good launch pad to hopefully build and improve as we move forward. So, but yeah, I think that the check-ins is critical if you're doing a project like this. So
yeah, and actually, so whilst we've been pulling out some kind of really specific, interesting reference points that here from learning, there are obviously almost the usual kind of lessons learned from any project that requires a kind of effective partnership working as well, and understanding the deadlines, the hard and fast deadlines that are set by regulators, working back from that from a scheduling and timelines kind of perspective, key milestones, but building within that understanding that if this approach is more consultative and partnership liaison led than it is kind of commissioned and waiting for a response, that does require more time and resource maybe than other projects might that we might be used to working on. So I think that was just something that's worth thinking on. So conscious of time and that we should move ourselves forward. In a moment I'll do some kind of top level kind of views and reflections and some kind of comments to wrap us up before we step into questions. But maybe just briefly, there are a few areas around future ideas for vulnerability, and there were 3 areas that maybe that we kind of picked out that might be worth us just talking about briefly. I don't know, Nick, if you wanted to talk to that first point about creating a minimum standard.
Yeah, so I think as we went through the project, we saw obviously a lot of the data sets are national, the census data, the health reports. There's a lot of national level data that we then obviously funneled down into regional forecasts and views. So it just feels like, having been through the process and obviously seen some of the chat as well about other projects that are going on, that there is the opportunity here to create potentially a national view that obviously each water company could then tailor down into something that gives them a really localized view, and that having a centralized kind of pot of data would be a more cost-effective way of feeding in updates from various places rather than all water companies doing it separately. So you get the economy of scale of doing everything once into a central input, and then it rolls out at a localized level. So that's why I think some sort of minimum standard around developing that at a national level, and then giving the flexibility for companies to use that data in a way that's right for their business plans and their customer bases, feels like something that should be explored and discussed. See, given this is a ever growing challenge, so partnerships are going to be key, and if we could partner on data which should be driving prioritizations of decisions, that seems to make natural sense. So that's why we wanted to flag this as an area for further discussion. So
thank you, Nick. And Davide, I don't know if there's anything that you maybe feel you haven't said yet, but just broadly in terms of use of data and updating a model.
Yeah, so I think at the back of what Nick just said about sort of having this pool of data that all companies collect together, I think because I've worked with water companies for a bit now, and I do see how there are certain areas such as emissions, for example, where there are standardized tables, for example, that each water company has to fill in order to comply with Ofwat and in what is required. And I think that there's no reason for that not to be, that shouldn't be the same for vulnerability. And so I think that we could still work with, data produced every now and then and try to make the most out of it. But really, when it comes to vulnerability, you're talking about individual people that either about them because they tell you, or you have to go and find them. And if you really truly want to do something good, and in terms of also understanding where these people are and trying to provide them the best service, I think that collecting the data at what company level, provided that there is a standardized methodology to do so, I think could be a way forward for us to be able to make better model in the future. And again, updating models also means providing new data points, because you always work with data that you had in the past, and as you go more and more in the future, the more unreliable your model becomes. But if you do have, in fact, a solid grounding, a solid baselining, then that becomes less problematic than it is to use national level data sets.
Yeah, thank you, Davide. And then just briefly, I suppose the nature of uncertainty. There are always lots of types of uncertain areas, and one might well be the use of AI when it comes to regulated essential services providers, and the challenges and opportunities that might exist within the application of AI tools. Something internally that we talk about at Sustainability First, a bit like thinking about a sharp knife in the hands of a Michelin star chef, that when it's used as an effective tool, and there's good use of it as a tool, it can produce something that's beautiful. But obviously also in the wrong hands, it can be dangerous. So it's understanding the role that AI might play as a tool in helping to think through and work through data, but always recognizing that it is a tool. It's not the provision of a complete alternative to human intervention, especially when we're thinking about the complexities and nature of vulnerability and just how human the conversation must be. So I'm going to move us on for the final comments section before we go into questions, and just really wanted to conclude by recognizing first and foremost and calling out again that vulnerability is no longer peripheral. It is clearly central to regulatory compliance, to customer trust, and to long-term service planning. And part of that is place-based. Place-based forward-looking analysis is essential if companies are to move positively forwards towards that kind of keeping chase with the changing nature and dynamism of vulnerability, and moving beyond the previous version, that kind of almost reaction to the need to maintain a PSR database, and expectations around partnership, about data sharing, early intervention, and thinking cross-sectorally are now explicit rather than optional. So just to mention as well a kind of a plug from Sustainability First, that obviously we're a small and independent charity. One of the ways that we work with water companies and with energy companies is through our Sustainability Leaders Programme. That's how we were connected first with Nick and colleagues at South Staffs and Cambridgeshire Water. That this programme that we offer is really quite unique. It's about having access to us as a critical friend in our approach to partnerships, that is grounded in practical applications we've seen this morning, that we bring our thinking to meet modern regulatory and business operational needs, and that we also convene policy deep dive conversations and teach-ins, share insights and cross-sector experiences. We offer consulting, as we did through this project, at a discounted rate for those who are in our programme as well. And we always work to network across sectors so that we're bringing ideas and experiences to life in different contexts, and make our own networks as accessible as possible to senior decision makers in the regulators themselves, in central government, and in the civil society groups that we know are a key part of partnerships too. So I think we're moving next into the questions section. I think we now go back to Leah.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again, everybody, for a great session. I think we have everybody except Laura on camera at the moment. So Laura, if you just want to pop your camera on for the final Q&A session, thank you very much. We did just have one more poll to share as well, just to gain audience thoughts about the changing nature of future regulation in water. So I'll launch that now while the Q&A starts. Your insights are super valuable to the team, so if you can answer this question, that would be brilliant. But what I'm going to do is stop sharing the presentation so we can see our lovely presenters a little bit better. And we'll dive into the Q&A. Please do feel free to keep putting questions into the chat while the Q&A session goes ahead. We will try and answer them all. So starting off with a question, I think, for Nick. What was the duration of this overall project? How long did it actually take for you to run it and finalise the findings? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so we started the project in December 2024 and finished it in April 2025. We probably did most of the key elements of it between January and March in terms of developing, gathering all the data together, doing the gap analysis, and then the forecasting was probably done in that 3-month window. So it was, we probably should have started sooner, given the learnings, but we turned the project around. So I would advise that you build in a little more time if you're starting something like this from fresh, if possible. But yeah, we delivered on time, and it all fed into developing our vulnerability strategy. So credit to everyone who worked a lot of long hours to get it over the line. So
great, thank you, Nick. Does anybody want to add to that at all, or?
Just going to mention very briefly, Leah, obviously, I think it really helped from our perspective that we had an existing partnership and relationship with Nick and colleagues at South Staffs, and that means that you've already gone quite a long way to have it, having a working relationship to be able to start from kind of platform to get moving. But it also means from our perspective, being that consultant that we just want to meet needs and know that hard and fast deadlines really are hard and fast, so you just got to get on with it and get it done.
Absolutely, thank you, David. Cool. So the next question is from Kate. It's quite a long one with a bit of context. If you want me to repeat any bits, do let me know. I think it's one for you, David. So at Wessex Water, we've worked with the Centre for Sustainable Energy over the past 2 years to help identify eligible customers. Our gap analysis and eligibility approach align with Ofwat's estimates. CSE also work closely with energy distributors and Ofgem and have been active in this area since 2012. Because vulnerability often spans both energy and water, it feels helpful to align approaches where possible. With that being said, it would be useful to understand how the CSE approach compares with the one described today, for example, where they align, where they differ, and how the two approaches might complement each other.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question. Thanks for asking it. Maybe just I'll think about in the first instance, maybe how they align, then think about how they differ, and then essentially conclude that it is, there is a complementary nature to them. So there is a strong degree of alignment at a strategic level. So there's a shared view of vulnerability as being multidimensional, but both approaches do recognise that vulnerability goes well beyond affordability alone and sits across health, disability, age, language, digital exclusion, wider socioeconomic factors. So absolutely, there is a kind of a shared starting point from that. The use of proxy indicators as well, rather than self-identification, like in CSE's work with DNOs and Ofgem, today's approach does use that kind of robust proxy data to estimate underlying need and recognises that many customers who'd benefit from support never self-identify or register. So again, a similar challenge there. There's close alignment with regulatory methodologies too. So both approaches do intentionally align with Ofwat and Ofgem thinking, including the census-based estimates of eligibility and gap analysis, ensuring outputs are defensible from a regulatory and a funding decision perspective. And there's also strong emphasis on cross-sector learning. So it's great that you've mentioned CSE in the energy sector. The CSE model and the work shown today do both stem from the view that energy and water vulnerabilities do overlap heavily, and that alignment where possible does reduce burden on customers and hopefully improves outcomes. So both are grounded in a very similar kind of principles and philosophical approach, kind of proactive identification, evidence-led targeting, regulatory credibility. Just in terms of differing, that mostly focused on it's about focused application rather than the fundamentals. So energy network versus water service lens. If you think about that first, CSE's work from a distribution network operator perspective is primarily framed around network risk, resilience, outage planning, fuel poverty, whereas today's approach is explicitly rooted in water service design, affordability support, PSR delivery, and customer experience. So there are some distinctions there. Greater emphasis on place and service design. The approach presented today, as you've seen, puts heavier weight on place-based analysis at a small area level, understanding how vulnerability interacts with service journeys, so metering, billing, incidents, communication, and how insight feeds directly into operational decisions, not just the risk planning side of things. And there's a future, we'll be quite explicit about future looking projections for water specific needs as well. So, while both approaches do look forwards, we've really made a point of showing that we're projecting non-financial vulnerabilities over a medium and longer term through AMP8 and beyond explicitly to inform water company long-term planning and investment strategies. And I think we've also highlights the importance of that, the transparency around it as well, the difference between confidence and uncertainty. So we were intentionally explicit about recognizing that too, that which vulnerabilities can be forecast with relatively high confidence, like age, disability trends, and where scenario-based approaches are more appropriate, especially on affordability, that a level of transparency is really clear to show where the assumptions have been made. And therefore, how you might expect scrutiny to play out. So I kind of hope that does recognise the kind of where the similarities and differences lie. But I think they are complementary approaches.
Absolutely, thank you, David. I don't know if Nicholas, Laura, or Davide, you'd like to add anything to that at all? No, great. I guess a question from me really, obviously with the knowledge sharing side of Spring, what we're looking to do is kind of help organisations adopt solutions at a greater pace, as I mentioned in the intro. And from the work that Spring has done, we've realised that business case building can be quite a barrier when it comes to adoption of new projects and improvements. So I was just wondering if the team at South Staffs at all had any sort of advice for anyone looking to build out a similar project to what you've shared today, and looking to build a similar business case for strategic improvements like this one.
Yeah, reflecting back, Leah. Yeah, so the business case, obviously, there's multiple angles from it. One was obviously the regulatory landscape was changing, that David outlined earlier on a slide. We also recognised that we could see in some of the early data we were collecting that this was a growing need, and that, as we said during the presentation, we couldn't be everywhere at once. So in order to ensure that our executive team, our board, and ultimately the people delivering all the great work we do around PSR, we needed to be very data driven, and that we are as a smaller water company, we pride ourselves in being at the heart of the local community. So we needed to get to a place where we had that granular level of insight at that LSO, down to that LSOA level, so that we could be partnering with the right organisations who had the right skill sets to help us get the message out and support customers alongside our community outreach team, and that we were prioritising everything we do with a view on how things are going to change up to 2040. So it was kind of a combination of regulatory and needing to be very clear about why we were prioritizing doing certain things over others. So that's where the business case came from back in 2024, when we were first working on the draft strategy, and about the need to accelerate this, because we just felt that making an investment now would pay dividends in the long run, particularly as we come to the next price review period as well, and being really clear to the regulator around this. This is what our customer base looks like. These are their needs. This is how they're going to change, and this is our service proposition to deliver against that. So that narrative is vital, and without this data, I just don't see how we could have done that as effectively as we can now do. So absolutely. I think that's one view. So.
Great, Nick, thank you. And we have had a couple more questions off the audience, which we should have time to answer briefly. So Andrew has asked, have you compared the model data to actual consumer vulnerability data?
I think I can take this one to start with. So we actually use the available vulnerability data forecasted to fine-tune our own projections. So actually we reversed it in a way that we didn't just model it based on a model that we created. We used bespoke models and then reverse engineer that to our data sets. So what that means is that, for example, for the real impact model, we use the national projections for different health conditions, and we then apply those projections to our service areas and see how changing demographics from ONS would then propagate the projections across the two service areas. So we didn't actually make numbers ourselves. We use point-based projections, which is what kind of I was arguing about the difficulty of making projections, which is that currently they are just point-based at national level, and we reverse engineer that to ensure that we could do that at service area level.
Great, thanks so much for sharing, Davide. Another question just for South Staff's team was quickly, how did you get the approval and buy-in from your board / exec level to run with this work, which is quite similar to the business case, the question, I think.
Yes, yeah, no, thanks for the question, G. Yeah, I think it comes back to being able to evidence that every pound of money you spend on your PSR outreach is, you have the evidence to say this is why we are doing it. This is why it aligns with our overall customer strategy that the vulnerability strategy sits within. So having this really granular data board, like this is clear an area of critical risk, it's going to grow. If we don't invest now, then these are the risks, both from a customer perspective, a regulatory perspective. So, and we just felt that it was obvious from the data that we didn't know enough about our customers 3 years ago at that granular level. So I think a combination of those things made it a really clear-cut case. And the people I've spoken to since we undertook the work have been surprised that at the budget to actually deliver it as well. I'm happy to, I see that was a question earlier, take that one offline, but we feel we got a really good piece of valued work that's going to, as we update it over time, can inform our strategy ongoing. So I think investing up front will pay dividends long term, and I think that was recognised by our team and our board as well. So
brilliant.
Hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't know if Laura, did you want to add anything quickly, or are you happy with that?
No, I think Nick's covered that beautifully. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And then a final question from Samantha is, firstly, thank you for sharing the work and the findings. Building on Kate's earlier question, there has been variations of this work carried out across sectors. One example is National Grid and their social indicator mapping. Wondered if similarly you were looking to publish this data and make it accessible to all. That's for anyone who wants to.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, like I say, it's pretty early days for me, but being totally honest, Samantha, not at this point, but I think it's something that myself coming from the energy sector is something that I think we would like to look into looking forward.
I was going to say that as a charity, we're conscious of the trade-offs of meeting specific kind of commercially sensitive and client sensitive needs versus making public known the approach, the methods, and I think the idea here is that this is one part of socializing the approach to this, and that there should be this kind of greater transparency and collective nature. And in fact, we've previously, from an energy perspective, half hourly settlement data from smart meters is a really powerful data set. It's the anonymization of that data that also matters just as much as it's used to inform pricing and decision making that's made too. So I think it's recognizing that kind of that balance as we meet needs, but also protect kind of the vulnerability of privacy as well within that too.
Great, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of the questions. David, I don't know if you wanted to take a minute to just reflect on the other poll results that we've had from your thought leadership session before we then close the session off.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone as well. We wanted to ask almost a wider question, as we're Sustainability First. We're really interested in the regulated space of essential services more widely than water. So we're asking a question about, is there something here that you'd want to share with a wider group of policymakers, civil servants, government officials, politicians, and others, thinking about this kind of better outcomes for customers in vulnerable circumstances. I do see that some have said no comment, completely understand that. Consideration, innovation, needs backing, somebody's referred to like Northumbrians, so I think that's recognising the Innovation Festival that exists up in the northeast as well. Support. So it's consistency, really, isn't it? It's that understanding that these are big things that are here to stay, and big challenges that are here to stay for the sector to grapple with, and therefore it does need greater prominence and backing and support from those in different parts of the decision-making process, who are then shaping the way that we approach this from a regulated sector perspective. So thank you very much for your insights.
Great. Thank you, David, and thank you to all of our presenters for the hard work that has gone into the presentation today. I hope the audience has found it as valuable as we have, and you have some great insights to take back to your own organisations. We do, as I say, measure that actually at Spring, so if you could take a moment to answer our feedback poll, which I believe my colleague has just put in the chat again, that would be really appreciated. As I say, it gives us some great insight into whether these sessions are actually delivering value to you and your organisation and the wider sector too. So any feedback you can give us is appreciated. Thank you again to the audience for taking the time out of your day to come today, and thank you again to the presenters as well. I think we'll leave it there. Have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye.